Saturday at some point.
Oh, darn it, I'll be gone.
Saturday at some point.
But you belong to DHS and inspector DHS.
Yes.
Does that work?
I think it works in some ways. I think government oversight is important when I think it's external from the standpoint of Congress, but also internalized from the standpoint within government to be able to sort of push some things. So DOJ Civil Rights, for example, has its own sort of subpoena power to investigate local law enforcement. For example, even though this administration has essentially made that impossible. I think what would have been really valuable with CRCL is if we had also had subpoena power. Our civil rights and civil liberties, DHS, CRCL. But if we had had that kind of subpoena power, our recommendations that we were administering to ICE, to DHS, TSA, CBP, I said DHS, USCIS, and others could have had a little bit more teeth associated with them. But the prospect of a formal document acknowledging the wrongs is still foiable, right? It's still something that can be looked at. And so I think there was some room there. I think we made an impact on detention centers and the way that medical care is provided in ICE detention centers, for example. I think those were good spaces. My work was primarily focused on ICE and local ICE enforcement, field enforcement, and ICE and local law enforcement collaborative partnerships, both sort of formal and informal, and then southern border issues.
That's fascinating.
So I think we were able to do some things, but the change in administration, and I lasted for about 5 months.
The change of administration?
Yeah, because I'm not a
You
political.
lasted a long
I'm not a
time then.
political. I was a civil servant. So I was not a political appointee that was connected to an administration. So once an administration leaves, then I leave government. I was was hoping to be a more long-term government employee that would be able to sort of switch into different agencies at a certain point. And so I stayed throughout a certain period of time, and then was like, fuck this. To be honest with you, I was like, I'm gonna get out of this shithole. I gotta get out of this nonsense.
Who's left in DHS wants to talk to me? Anyone?
There are some good people. I can get you some good contacts.
I work outside the country, so there are a lot of things that just gotta be several hundred miles closer to Washington to know what's up.
Well, if you want to, you're always welcome to look at my LinkedIn and see who I'm connected to, because I'm thinking for my public policy program.
Awesome.
Just let me know, I'll introduce you.
I've connected some people who, there was a whistleblower about family detention, and I was the person who connected him to him. So, yeah, he was a doctor. Yeah.
Gosh. They're gonna start it again?
Hell yes.
You guys about ready to
Family
get started?
separation will be worse when
Ready?
detention is
You
still.
all ready?
Yeah. Thank you, Trish.
Old friends now? Ready to
Ready to
go?
go. Ready to go.
Huh?
Oh, should we just we can
Liz
scooch
wasn't
down?
able to.
We can go down.
We just scooch down. Yeah.
I'm feeling lonely down here.
Well, we can't let that happen.
I thought
Now I
was
need to
one
know that
more.
this one works. It does.
Sorry.
Oh yeah.
Now you won't feel lonely because our name tags are going to be very dramatic.
Perfect.
Make sure I have easy access to that one as well. Now you can watch me when I'm talking too much. Trick me and nudge me.
All right, everyone take a seat and we'll get started. Today is Wednesday, April 10th, 2019. It's noon, and this is panel 2302, entitled How I Got Here. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Trish Thomas. I'm the CEO at Team, an ad agency in Denver. Very happy to be here moderating today. We're going to hear from young professionals as they share their paths from undergrad, exploring the challenges, achievements, and failures that have led them to their current successes. Thank you all for joining us. I'm going to briefly introduce you, and then I'd love you to share your story with the audience. Allie, I'll start with you. Allie Barta is the founder and CEO of Nunamed. Nuna is a mission-driven company offering botanically based solutions for common health issues. Allie's commitment to her herbal products company is deeply personal. Her first product was developed to treat her own chronic urinary tract infections caused by an industrial accident at work in 2014. The accident occurred during a warehouse tour in Illinois. A lift dropped suddenly, almost killing her, and resulting in Allie having an open tibia fracture, a broken back, and spinal cord injury. The accident ended her career at Haines Celestial Group, and her injuries triggered lengthy surgeries and physical therapy, ultimately leading to these chronic urinary tract infections that were resistant to antibiotics. Her personal discovery of something that worked led NunaMed's first product, urinary tract support tea. Allie has an MBA from the Darden School of Business at the University of Virginia and a Master of Public Policy from the Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. So welcome, Allie.
Thank you.
Nadia Ferozvi is next. She's at the end. Wave, Nadia. She's a project manager overseeing strategy development and grant making for the Just and Inclusive Society project at the Democracy Fund, a bipartisan organization committed to ensuring that our political system withstands new challenges and delivers on its promise to the American people. Nadia recently served as a policy advisor in the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties in the Department of Homeland Security. She also served as domestic policy coordinator at the Arab American Institute and a staff attorney at the Pacific American Legal Resource Center. Nadia is a founding board member of Many Languages, One Voice, supporting community-led initiatives to increase the meaningful inclusion of DC area immigrants who do not speak English as their primary language. She holds degrees from Loyola, the University of Baltimore School of Law, and American University College of Law. So welcome, Nadia. And Maya Averbach is next. Maya is a freelance reporter, and she's based in Mexico City. She's written for the New York Times, the New Republic, the Washington Post, Wired, Medium, The Progressive, many, many publications. She covers asylum and immigration, including some recent policies that have affected people migrating from Central America. She's reported on migrant caravans, deportees returning to the U.S. with their families, family separation practices, men who have left gangs. She's a graduate of Yale Journalism Initiative. So thanks for joining us, Maya. I'd love for each of you to just take 5 minutes and share a little bit more than I just did about your life trajectory and how you got here. And I'm going to let you guys know that thanks to some rods in her back, Allie is going to stand up some while she speaks to make her a little more comfortable. So
I guess you get those allowances once you break your back. But hi, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Allie Barta. And I was trying to think back to when I was in some of your seats. I was a senior in college going, what am I going to do with my life? And I guess I had a bit of the startup itch then. There was a small startup called Little Duck Organics that I was really interested in working for. I thought they had a great product. And so I took the little college money that I had and I flew up to Boston to meet the founder. And it seemed like we kicked it off great. I thought that I was going to be their sales rep, and I was elated, only for me to come back to Virginia and that communication line to just be nothing. And so that was really scary. I was the commencement speaker at our graduation. Everything was printed in my bio. I was going, oh my goodness, what am I going to do? They think I'm doing this one thing, but I'm not. But life goes on. And so anyway, I ended up applying to a lot of jobs in the natural and organic space because I am a big advocate of people feeling great from the inside out. And so I got a lot of rejection there too. I wouldn't hear from companies. And so now one of my big pushes is whenever someone wants an internship, or not jobs yet, I'm a little startup, but at that same time, I always want to respond to people and say, hey, it's not going to work out right now, but hopefully something will in the future. And so I applied, got probably 20 or 30 just nothings from different companies. And then finally, I kept bugging the Haines Celestial Group because I had my heart set on them. I said, this is the largest manufacturer of natural and organic food and body care products. I need to work for this company. And so I was willing to take any job. I was like, if I can just be a janitor or something, I'll prove myself, I'll work my way up, and then we'll see what happens. But fortunately, the first job I had was as the North Carolina key account sales rep. And so I moved to Raleigh, North Carolina, not knowing anybody, which was different from going to college and seeing friends every single place that I went, to going and not having anyone that I really knew and be driving around all the time, so I couldn't create a real social network. And so that happened for a while. It got a little bit exhausting where Whole Foods at the time had these things called fair shares. And so you would go with the other brokers and sales reps and you'd start, some nights you'd work all night, which I've never really been that much of a night owl. And then other times you would get in there like at 3:30 or 4 in the morning and have to get new products in on behalf of your company and the other companies. And so it was a little tough. I was getting tired, but I was very fortunate and blessed that I had a wonderful mentor, Freddie, who kind of advocated for my case and said, hey, Allie, I really think you'd be great for this other position. And so a year and a half into my job at Hain, I became regional business manager, which I was then responsible for the distribution and independent stores for the natural channel for the personal care division. So I was really excited. It was a lot of responsibility, but fortunately I had great people helping me learn the way. And then fast forward, and a year and a half-ish into that, I was on a little about 36-hour work trip to Illinois. I'd since moved back to Richmond, Virginia, where my then boyfriend was living and going to dental school. And I was just supposed to be, hey, Chris, I'll be gone, I'll be back. And I was on a tour of one of my distributors' factories, and it was just one of those things. I was excited to see what it looked like on the inside since I hadn't seen a factory before like that. And completely casual, hey, do you want to go up on this lift? They were so proud of how high their factory was, and you could get the best view from the lift. And so I said, absolutely, like, I'd love to see what you're so proud of. And then sure enough, it got stuck, and then fast forward, and it dropped. And so that moment was not even moment. It was over an hour and a half. I was on the phone with my poor dad saying my goodbyes. But it was tough. And so every single second I had broken back, spinal cord injury, so I couldn't move. And then my tibia sticking out of my leg. But fortunately, I was wearing pants, so I didn't know that part. And it was one of those seconds where you kind of thought it was going to be your last, but I'm really glad for both me and the operator. It wasn't, but it was definitely something that completely transformed and changed my life because I couldn't travel like I used to. My parents are here because I really don't enjoy traveling on my own anymore. There are just complications related to that. But at the same time, I'm not someone who really wants to hide and go, woe is me, so I needed to figure out something else. And so lots of surgery. Antibiotic resistance was a big one because I kept getting urinary tract infections or UTIs due to the spinal cord injury. And so I had to decide what was next. And so with that, I started studying for the GMAT while I was laid on the couch in Chicago between going to physical therapy sessions. And I ended up taking the GMAT to go to business school, met someone else who was on the board at the University of Virginia at the time who said, Allie, do you know what? You really have a heart for public service. I said, yeah, I do. What do you think? And he said, well, I think you should go check out that new Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. And so I did. I was convinced the dean was so smart. I said, my goodness, I have a lot to learn from this man. I think I need to apply to this school too. And fortunately, they let me in. Darden let me in for my MBA. And so I started that in 2015, at which point I was dealing with antibiotic resistance for the UTIs. And so that was top of mind related to my healthcare policy classes. And I did some research on what was available around the world in terms of complementary and alternative therapies. And I realized that there was a gap here in the United States, especially when it came to science-backed, evidence-based products. And so I was thinking about that, dealing with my own problems. Then my mom went to her naturopathic doctor in California, and she sent me this little bag of herbs in a Ziploc bag. And I looked at it and I said, Mom, if the antibiotics aren't working, I don't know how this is going to. But it did. And so I went, my goodness, to whom much is given, much is expected. This is working on me. I need to get it out to other people. And so once I started Darden, that second year of grad school, I was full-fledged, hey, what can we do to build something around this? And so with that, it's been quite a journey in terms of entrepreneurship, and I'm constantly trying to prove to myself that it'll work. But It is. It's one of those great jobs where you lose money from whatever money you've saved. You have zero benefits, but thankfully I have a husband who works and has that. But at the end of the day, I get these testimonials, and it's a phenomenal reason for being, and it makes me feel like I am making that difference that I really aspired to. And hopefully urinary tract support tea will be the first of many products. So if you have any suggestions for future products, let me know. But the journey is still evolving, and that's where it is right now.
Thanks, Allie. Maya, you're up.
Hi, I'm Maya Averbach. I'm a journalist based in Mexico City. I cover immigration. I knew I wanted to be a journalist since I was in high school. I went to a high school in New York with 3,000 people that had, for that reason, a very functional school newspaper that tried to cover every sports team and every club and every bad teacher and every student council decision as though it were all very serious. And the first thing they sent me to do was cover a protest by students to try to make sure that New York City didn't take away Metro cards, reduce Metro cards for students. And I thought, wow, this is an incredible way to be a writer and to try to be a writer who actually can do something useful and can actually take language and think about ways that it can hold people accountable, can transform different communities, can be used to tell all kinds of different stories. But really, what an incredible excuse. I can talk to whoever I want and they'll talk to me because I came with a reporter, a notebook and a recorder, and said, I'm trying to write about this. So I went to Yale afterwards. I studied comparative literature / humanities, because there wasn't really a journalism program. There's sort of burgeoning journalism program that's really focused on sort of long-form storytelling, and had a really wonderful set of teachers who were trying to guide us through that, which is, on the one hand, pretty spectacular in the sense that you get sort of really lovely attention from professors, you know, like I studied with Bob Woodward at one point, and it's really, that was a treasure. And on the other hand, it also means that you're thrown into a journalism world that is quickly changing, that is interested in video and tech and social media and data and sort of fast production that you have to learn on the job. And so a lot of what I've been doing over the last few years is trying to figure out different ways to adapt to that field, trying to figure out what I can do as a reporter that is also still really connected to the thing that it started me in this profession, which is a sort of basic love of storytelling, and figure out where to go from there. So I graduated and was given this huge gift, which was a grant to go and report in Mexico on immigration. I had studied refugee law, and at the time that I was graduating was trying to figure out ways to go report on that. And so took my plane ticket and flew to Mexico City sort of 6 months after graduating, and started trying to get my bearings. So there's really no structure to it, but that meant emailing anyone under the sun who I thought lived in Mexico City, who maybe knew someone I knew who worked in any sort of field, and saying, do you know anyone who's covering these issues? Who can you connect me to? And then going to a lot of shelters. Mexico is a country that has had historically tons of migration. I think what's interesting about the caravans is it makes it seem like migration is a new phenomenon, and all of a sudden people are marching from Central America to the US, which is in fact not the case. There's a robust shelter system across Mexico, and so a lot of what I did in my first year is going to those shelters, talking to people, whether they were 14-year-olds who had just left a few days before and were in southern Mexico, talking to people who had ended up finally in Tijuana in northern Mexico and were in some of those big shelters there, figuring out whether they were going to cross the border on their own, whether they had to pay someone, whether they were going to wait in the asylum system. And then really saying to people, you know, I got here a few months ago, but please can you let me tag along with you, whether they were photographers, whether they were activists, whether they were lawyers, saying, is there an extra spot on this bus? I spent several months traveling with collectives from Central America who are families of migrants who have disappeared, in their transit through Mexico. It's an issue that's not made very visible, in part because there's very bad accountability. It might be a few thousand people, it might be a few 100,000 people, and we're talking about from the mid-'80s until now. And we know that it's an issue because there was sort of a spat of really terrible murders in the early 2010s in Mexico, in northern Mexico, that made headlines. But there's very little accounting of all of the other people who call their families, let's say, when they're about to cross the border and then just disappear. Some of those people are alive and living in towns, have started new families. They might have been imprisoned at some point. They might have lost their phone numbers for their families. And others are very fortunately deceased. And so a lot of my early time there in Mexico was just being thrown into these different actions that were group actions where people were looking to have more media coverage and being very honest about the fact that I had arrived there pretty recently and was trying to get my bearings, and then having that be continuous, right? So going back with those same collectives the following year and the year after that, and traveling with some of the people who work with them to Central America, to Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala to try to talk about whether the conditions are where people are leaving from, what are the conditions of people's families once they have lost a loved one and are trying to restructure the family around that absence. And then I would say a lot of careers, I guess, are also luck and are also, I don't want to discount the fact that while on a grant, it's much easier, obviously, to buy yourself a bus ticket or a plane ticket, even if that's $50, to try to get to a place, and then to say to an editor, I'm already here, let me cover this for you. Which was really the case with the migrant caravans. I'd known about the groups that were organizing them previously, but I went and there was only one US reporter there, and I emailed 10 editors and said, I promise you this is a big story, I promise you it's going to be important. And nobody responded until Trump tweeted about it, and then they needed people. And then they let me write for them. And I think a lot of reporting then is just trying to be abreast of things and trying to learn a lot from the people who have dedicated their life's work to documenting immigration, to working with families, to working through shelter systems, to trying to navigate asylum law, to try to help people understand asylum law, which is so complicated and tricky. And so a lot of what I've done over the past year then is try to document those different changes to migration, to try to talk about what it means for people to band together in a group of 7, 8, 10,000 people and walk, why that's different from trying to have more clandestine forms of migration, why that's different from smuggling that is responsible for probably the majority of immigration that is happening on the border right now, which is not to say that it's all criminal, but rather that if you can have the option between taking a month-long trip with very few resources through Mexico, through cartel territory, through criminal territory, versus borrowing money from your family to pay to take a bus in 5 days, there's a sort of obvious choice there that the US is struggling to respond to. And obviously then trying to remain, I think there are different ways to measure what your, I think, value is as a journalist. One is how many pieces can you publish, where can you publish them, and how many people read them, and the other is how accountable can you be to the people who you are writing about. Is there any value to them, which is, I think, an ongoing discussion that I can have with people who I interviewed months ago who now say to me, I'm still stuck in Tijuana. Or someone texted me this morning and they said, I'm the parent of the kid who you saw who was hit by a van who recovered, but we're still in southern Mexico and we're still waiting for our refugee papers here. It's been 5 months, what should we do? And it's not my job to give them an answer, because I'm a journalist, and so you're always in that delicate position of saying, what is my responsibility? And then also of being always in the right place at the right time, and trying to figure out where you should travel. And yeah, and I am not from a Mexican family. My parents are from India and Israel. I became interested in asylum issues also because the woman who took care of me when I was a kid was a Tibetan refugee and was going through the asylum process for, I don't know, it seemed like 10 years, but I think when you're a small child, scale is very confusing, but there are a lot of fraudulent lawyers involved. And so I think that's always also something to take into account when you're arriving in a place where you say, I speak the language here, but you have a lot to learn about the context. And again, that has been a long process of dialogue with everyone who's working on the same issues, with other reporters. I'm lucky to have a really wonderful community of freelancers who are based in Mexico City, who all support one another, whether that's through security. It means that if I get on a bus by myself and cross 7 states, that someone is tracking my phone so that they know what time I'm supposed to get off the bus, and if I don't get off the bus, then someone will call somebody else. Or if that means asking your peers, because you're a freelancer, hey, I don't have an editor at this point who's going to talk me through the early steps of this piece, can you do me that favor, and hoping to repay that favor in the future. So it's been a great adventure so far.
Thanks so much, Maya. Nadia?
Hi, everyone. I know we've got not too much time, and I want to be able to open this up for questions to the audience too, so we'll try to go through this quickly. My name's Nadia Ferozvi. I'm from Baltimore. I consider Baltimore the greatest city in the world. I understand that I'm not in Baltimore at the moment, and others may feel differently. So be it. So when I also to sort of share this as sort of listening to what Maya said and what Ali said in terms of their own journeys. Just to sort of share a little bit of a personal story, I am the proud product of refugees who were our children, and the proud product of immigrants to the United States, and I am very proud to have been so, and sort of migration is a strong sort of prominent aspect of my family and the families of many people. I was an English major in college, and there was a running joke at the time that how do you get an English major off your doorstep? And it's to pay them for the pizza. So that was the joke about what we would do. I was interested at a time in contemplating a PhD in literature. I didn't really know what that was, but I ended up sort of thinking about law school. And one of the reasons for that was I graduated in May of 2001, and a few months later, 9/11 happened. And I had been thinking about law school, and then 9/11 sort of solidified that. My family is also Muslim in the United States, and post 9/11 there was a lot of discrimination that Muslim communities and those who were perceived to be Muslim on account of race were facing. And so that which I had sort of known as sort of being discrimination in the past suddenly got solidified in terms of what my career choice was going to be. And so when I was in law school, I was really interested in studying international human rights, and that's what I thought I wanted to do. And while I was there, I started to see the really unique intersections between immigration and international human rights. And I personally had vowed to never become an immigration attorney, and that's precisely what I became, because I didn't want to be my family's lawyer. That's actually why I didn't want to be an immigration attorney. My mother was the eldest of 13, and I was like, this is going to be a lot of work. So, but I really then began to sort of fall in love with immigration, with gender justice and human rights work. And so I wanted to sort of expand upon that, and I did what's known as an LLM, a legal master's degree, and I did so in international human rights law, and that really solidified things again. And while I was there, I was in a program at American University where I was only one of 4 Americans in the whole program. All of the students were from outside of the country. We had a Supreme Court justice from South Korea. We had what was sort of the equivalent of the Attorney General from South Africa, a woman who wrote the Domestic Violence Code of Nigeria. So I've had the tremendous luxury of sort of being in a place where I've always been surrounded by just smarter and braver and more sort of courageous people, and they give you a lot of inspiration in a whole host of ways. When I came out of that program, I originally thought that I wanted to work in international organizations. I actually came out of that program thinking I didn't want to do that at all, and that I really wanted to focus on local work. And what I didn't know at the time was, sort of law school teaches you about the law. In some aspects, it teaches you to practice the law, but I didn't really know how to practice immigration. And so I went to a small firm in Maryland where I learned how to practice immigration. I knew that if you did X, Y, and Z, you were eligible for a green card. But I didn't know the forms you filled out to sort of get to that green card. I didn't know the agencies that you sort of applied to. I didn't know all of those sorts of things that you needed to do. And so I learned how to practice the law, engage with clients better and more in this small firm. And at the time, while I was at a small firm, I wanted to get back into nonprofit work. I had I'd been an intern, in the nonprofit sector when I was in law school, and I wanted to get back into that. Public service and public interest law was really sort of my passion. And at the time, this somewhat little-known senator was running for president. And I decided, why not go and sort of at least volunteer on this campaign, because Barack Obama has no chance of winning. And so if you're going to work on a presidential campaign, it's for this guy, because he's not going to win. And it was the right message and the right everything. And then lo and behold, he won. But at the same time, I left my firm and I decided to really try my hand at sort of public interest. But I tried my hand when I left the firm without a job. And so I was unemployed for about 9 months. And I was volunteering with the campaign, and I was doing what's called document review, which for lawyers is it's a very sort of lengthy analysis process, but big law firms sometimes need lawyers to look at evidence and to determine the evidentiary value of a document or more. And so they have sort of warehouses of lawyers that are going through these documents, and I was doing that. It's really good pay, and I would look for sort of small projects like that for 2 months at a time, maybe 3 months at a time, that I could do that and then apply for other jobs. And so I was applying and applying and applying and not really getting much. But then finally, I got a position with an organization called the Asian Pacific American Legal Resource Center in Washington, D.C. And I was one of their immigration staff counsel, one of their staff attorneys. And what was great about that is that I really learned, I think, just this tremendous value of local organizing and lawyering together. What I sort of refer to as community lawyering, what I think is often called movement lawyering. And you're lawyering on behalf of communities most directly impacted, for communities who are exerting their agency for the change it is that they want to see. And so it was sort of a nonprofit legal aid office in a lot of ways. And the other thing that I worked on heavily was 99% of my clients did not speak English. And spoke different languages altogether. I'm an Urdu speaker, and so I was able to communicate with my clients who spoke Hindi and Urdu, because they're very, very similar in terms of language. But I utilize interpreters and translation and translators the whole time, which really got me focused on what we call language access, making sure that those who don't speak English have the same access to services as people who do. And really getting very passionate about that. And so I love the sort of community learning aspect of it. I love the language access piece. I used to carry around 200 or so cases at a time, not all of which were active, but that was sort of the standard. And then a big challenge sort of happened where the nonprofit bubble burst. There was sort of the economic downturn, and one of the first things that happens is philanthropic giving tends to go during those instances. And so when the nonprofit bubble burst, we had gotten to a point where we didn't make payroll a second time, quite on time, and that wasn't ideal. And I had student loans to pay, and that wasn't really happening. And so I knew it was time to. I knew it was time to go for a variety of reasons. One, when all of your clients are low income, when they don't speak English, when you're working on these issues, you immediately see the policy aspects of the work. And so I would work on immigration issues and what I refer to as wraparound immigration services. So I could be working on a green card application, and my client would also inform me that they're having difficulty filling out their food stamps application because it was in English, or they were having difficulty with a small contract dispute with their neighbor about sort of a dog jumping a fence and sort of doing something to the lawn. Just those sorts of other things that are actually harder when you are an immigrant, when you are sort of new to the country, when you don't necessarily know all of the various things you can be working on. So you sort of become a generalist in a lot of ways with one aspect of the law that you're focusing on and the other things coming up. And so I started to think, well, if I was working in government, perhaps these were some things we could change and create some more systemic change for these communities. And so the nonprofit bubble burst. I was looking at government at the time. And things sort of worked out. I was applying for a job at the DOJ, which I did not get. And instead, I went to the Arab American Institute at the time, and did so at the behest of a mentor, Dr. Jim Zogby, who is the president of the Arab American Institute, and whom I first met during my time at the Obama campaign. And more than that, my office was on the first floor, his office was on the sixth floor, and I used to go and bug them all the time because they had better food up there, frankly. And so we just sort of got to be pals and more. And he asked me to come on board and sort of do some of their domestic policy work. From some of my clients, I had been involved in some national security issues with immigrant clients, primarily Muslim, Arab, and South Asian clients who at the time were facing something called NSEERS, the National Security Entry and Exit Registration System, which, to be frank, is what I would call the first Muslim registry that the United States has had. And my clients were sort of driving me to sort of understanding more of these issues, and the Arab American Institute felt like the right place. And I, as a South Asian woman, felt it was really important to go to such an organization because I know that all of the issues that are impacting communities of color, Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities, immigrant communities, are still fundamentally based in race in this country. And as a South Asian woman working in an Arab organization, I wanted to really hone in on that more. While I was there, someone at the DOJ amazingly recommended me for a position at DHS. It was essentially the equivalent position at DHS, which was a little bit more germane to my immigration work. And so I left AAI and I went to the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at DHS, where I worked in what's called the compliance branch, and I investigated complaints alleging civil rights and civil liberties abuses on the part of the department in the manner in which the department effectuated its duties with the public. So I primarily was working on ICE complaints, the way that ICE conducted its immigration enforcement, the way that ICE worked with local law enforcement, immigration detention centers, and the southern border. So it's a bit hot these days. I was there for 6 years, and through the beginning of this administration. And it was during this administration that I wanted to be a good civil servant, and I wanted to stay and try to figure out how to do this well. And I had a very dear friend of mine who works on the Hill who was like, please, dear God, stay. And so I was trying to sort of do that. It just became untenable for me, I felt, sort of professionally and personally. When the Muslim ban was introduced, that hit me very hard, as I have family members outside of the country that would have been impacted by that. When the sort of policies were changing very dramatically, and when sort of my investigations were changing, when the sort of responses that we had previously asked for from component agencies were not being delivered, I knew that it was time to go. I knew that it wasn't sort of the right place to be anymore. And my options at that point in my head, you know, it's a remarkable thing to despite needing to go quickly, to still feel like you have options. It's a pretty profound thing to sort of be able to have. And I felt like I wanted to try my hand in three things: either getting into litigation, which I hadn't done much of. I've been in immigration court quite a bit, but real impact litigation and wanting to do more of that. Philanthropy, and sort of working in foundations, because I had previously written grant proposals, and so I understood the role that foundations and philanthropy had in change, and the private sector. And I put a question mark next to private sector because I didn't know what it was, really. And I was, a friend actually recommended me for a position at Democracy Fund, which is a foundation that Trish had sort of mentioned earlier, where I now am a project manager of a pool of funding aimed towards the protection of immigrant and refugee communities and Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. What's been really interesting is that I have always been a lawyer that sort of happened to be Muslim. I was a person that happened to sort of have this faith background. It was never going to be the crux of my work. I felt that if you were a good lawyer, a good immigration advocate, a good whatever, that would also sort of demonstrate that these are who Muslims are. And I didn't feel like I had that luxury anymore with the election of this president, because of how heavily my community had been targeted. And so the prospect of sort of working on issues sort of germane to immigrant communities and Masa, Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities seemed really attractive. It's hard. It's not an easy thing to do when it's your identity that is so much on the line in a lot of ways, but I'm grateful for the chances that I've had.
Great. Very, very interesting and diverse stories. So now I have a few questions. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for you in the audience to ask questions as well. Let's try to keep answers fairly brief, since everybody kind of has your backstory now. But when each of you were an undergrad, could you have imagined where you are today? What did you envision for your lives when you were in college? Allie, do you want to start?
Okay.
Go for it.
Well, I always laugh because I think about this in terms of I steered clear of the business school in undergrad. I said, I don't even want to go in that building. They're a little crazy and intense. And then I went and got my MBA. So I definitely don't think when I was an undergrad, that's the life I was planning on pursuing. I've always really wanted to do everything to try and help people. And so I think that's been consistent. And if any of you are going to that flipping your life trajectory tomorrow, I'll talk more about that because I thought I wanted to be a diplomat for a very long time and then that flipped. But I'd say in terms of since then, convenience and providing people with safe, healthy options has been my focus. At first it was related to fast food and now it's related to herbal supplements.
I just want to interject. If any of you have burning questions that you want to go ahead and get tabled for our Q&A period at the end, put your hand up and they'll bring a note card over to you. You can also visit the CWA app and go ahead and start logging questions for the session. And I'll ask as many of them at the end as I can. So, sorry to interrupt. Maya, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I think always the plans that you have for yourself in college change. And that's probably for the better. I remember my freshman year suite, I lived with 6 people. 5 of them were destined to be in med school, and only one of them actually ended up going. And the rest of them are doing entirely different things. But it took them a year or 2 years or maybe a little longer to figure out that they had no business being in med school and should probably do something different. And I think that oftentimes we are asked to sort of chart out what we plan on doing in 10 years, and that feels like the wrong question. In fact, it seems like you should figure out what you're going to do in the next 6 months that might be a useful way to learn, or it might be, as one teacher, I think my refugee law teacher told me when I graduated, like, go do something hard if you can. Like, go do something that's going to be challenging that you might not be able to do at another point in your life. So, like, take whatever resources you have right now and run with them. I was lucky. I got financial aid in college and didn't graduate with student debt, and so obviously that made a huge difference in the extent to which I could, like, get up and run. And I think that, I obviously had no conception of the degree to which I would be reporting on all of these major immigration issues that have become so important. And I also planned out my whole immigration reporting beat a year before the election happened, and was, sitting in a bar and a month into being in Mexico when the election happened, and that changed the entire trajectory of what I'm working on. And there are always going to be those big events, I think, that are major upheavals in your life.
Great.
The short answer is no, not at all. I had no idea what sort of being a lawyer was. Being a lawyer on television was screaming objection in a courtroom. And so that's what I thought it could look like, but I didn't quite know how to do it. So honestly, I had no clue what being a lawyer could be, or that using a law degree, you could do other things with it.
Great. All of you have achieved a lot at a relatively young age. What's been the single greatest skill, learning, or even maybe a personality trait that's been pivotal to your success?
One of you want to start, or you want me to start again?
Go ahead.
You can start. Okay. Grit. I truly think you have to roll with the punches of life because that's something that is definitely a given. But I think back, and I've been incredibly fortunate to have a wonderful support network, whether it is my parents through the good times and the bad, and my siblings, and my now husband that truly saw me through everything when we didn't know if I'd ever be able to walk again until now. And so, I've been incredibly blessed too. I've had the same best friend since I was 1.5, and she's now the graphic designer for Nunamed. So whatever you can do to find those people that get you on some level, I don't think it's always easy, but it certainly makes life a whole lot easier. And then having them see you and see the best in you, even when you don't see the best in yourself, I think that's huge, and it's not always a given, and it's something I struggled with when I was in college too. The first year, it's like, oh my gosh, shouldn't I have met my best friends yet? And I didn't. It took time, and I had a lot of questions, but yeah, it's definitely not a one-person sport, I think, when it comes to life.
I wouldn't say that I'm particularly good at this, but I admire people who are very good at taking rejection. I think that was one of the things I struggled with a ton for the first year. Now we joke about it. Freelancers often have tons of work and then have no work, and so it's like this little emotional roller coaster, and you start to recognize it in your colleagues, and so you can cheer them up a little bit when you're like, remember 2 weeks ago you had work. But there's a lot of online forums also dedicating to trying to get people to persevere through very unstable jobs and unstable job markets. One person in one of the sort of women freelancers group I'm in joked that she bought herself a pair of shoes every time she got to 100 rejections. So the goal was to not be afraid of sending out many emails a week and just saying, here's why my story would be a good fit for your publication, and that people get to know you even if they're turning you down. And people also, sometimes I've had it where I've sat down with editors when I've asked them to get coffee even though they've rejected or really never replied to any of my stories. But I say, like, I'm here for 2 days, can I get coffee with you? And which someone told me would work. I assumed it wouldn't, but apparently people are sometimes more willing to do that than to print your stories. And you can convince them of things in person that you never would be able to convince them of via email. And they would say to me, wow, I've never heard of that. And I said, well, you did. I emailed it to you 4 months ago, you know. I think that being able to take the lows and think of them as time to read or as time to send new story ideas, or it's time to call up people who you haven't talked to in many months and try to understand what they're working on and sort of brainstorm what you might want to work on, is incredibly valuable. And I'm still learning how to do it, but I think the people who do best as freelancers, or I guess as journalists in general, are people who get a lot of no's or a lot of no replies.
Very helpful.
So I got some advice sort of early on to wherever it is that you're working to try to make yourself indispensable and to be an asset everywhere you go. And I've really tried to take that to heart. And part of that comes with sort of being able to acknowledge that you don't know everything. And so it took a second, but I ask for help a lot. I ask my colleagues for help. I ask other mentors for help. I ask people for advice a lot. I ask other lawyers what my job is. I was speaking to Trish a little earlier. There's someone who was here yesterday who's a philanthropic advisor, and I grabbed her and I was like, what is my job? And so I think it's acknowledging what you don't know, and trying to be as much of an asset as possible, and asking for guidance and help.
Absolutely.
Nadia, to that point, I totally agree in terms of acknowledging what you don't know, because as you all know, I did not have a formal business background before getting an MBA. But one of my greatest takeaways was I would be in a classroom and they'd cold call you. But I had these classmates that I thought so highly of, and they went even higher on a pedestal for me when they acknowledged that they didn't know. And so you don't have to go to graduate school now. I've told you everything you need to know. You just have to acknowledge that you don't know things sometimes.
So true. Allie, you have had this difficult experience of losing your health and mobility. What does it mean for you to help other people maintain their health and vitality today?
So I wish that Nunamed had enough money to be able to have a campaign that was you know your body, because I think that's so true. And I've listened to some interesting podcasts about it's tough when you look at someone and you go, my goodness, they're in their mid-20s, mid-30s, et cetera. They're at the peak of their life. They're at their peak of their health. How could anything be wrong? And little do you know, like with me 2 weeks ago, I couldn't walk for a week because my knee wasn't working. Or I have to self-catheterize 9 times a day because my bladder still doesn't work and I can't pee on my own. And so I think a lot of times it's just meeting people where they are and acknowledging that they're facing their own struggles and just trying to support them in whatever they're going through. And by no means do I have the right answers for all of that, but at the same time, I think sometimes just being there for people and acknowledging that you don't know can certainly go a long way.
Nadia, you kind of touched on this, but in your current Many Languages, One Voice initiative that you co-founded, what kind of drives your passion to ensure that everybody not only has a seat at the table and justice, but also a voice, influence in the social discourse?
So Many Languages, One Voice, or MLOV, or as I call it, MLOV, is a small initiative in DC. I was one of the founding board members with a couple of colleagues. It's focused on language access for primarily immigrant communities, and making sure, again, that they have access to the same services as other people. When I was younger, when I was a kid, I sometimes interpreted for my grandmother at medical appointments, as well as at Social Security. My mother, whose first language was not English as well, this is a story that I feel like diminishes her a little bit, which I don't want to do as she's already passed, but she would be writing letters and didn't always know sort of what document you write a letter on. And I just started to realize that there was a privilege that I had in knowing some things, and the things that I didn't know, and that there is tremendous power in people who don't know what they're able to accomplish. And one, sometimes they don't know what they're able to accomplish, but two, when given a seat at the table, when being able to express themselves appropriately, when being able to share what it is that they want to do, they precisely know what they want. And I feel like I have a responsibility then to make sure that other communities who know what it is that they want to do have the same access to it. I also think as an immigrant woman who's come to this country, as a product of immigrants who came to this country, and as someone who is a woman of color and not African American, there is a tremendous responsibility that we have to remedy the historic racial disparities that have taken place in this country and the structural racism that limits the achievement and advancement of communities. And I, as a woman of color who isn't Black, should always be taking the back seat to make sure that everyone else is able to participate.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move to some Q&A from the audience now, and some of you are already asking questions on my list. So as I said earlier, we're going to utilize both the CWA app and note cards. So put your hands up if you'd like a note card. I'd appreciate it if you'd write as legibly as possible. And if you're a student, note that you're a student. I'm going to try to ask as many student questions as possible. On the app, to ask a question, just go to our session in the schedule, tap Q&A, and then you can insert and submit your question. Let us know if you have any issues. Let's see. Here's a good one. What was the best piece of advice you've been given, or what advice would you give to someone else?
You want to take it?
Yeah, I called a reporter who I didn't know, who is based in Texas, named Michelle Legro, and asked her for advice in my first year, about halfway through, and I said, I've done all these things, I've gone to these places, I've met these people, what should I do? And she said, you definitely don't know what the story is yet, so you should go and sit for many more months, and you can try to write and try to publish during that time, but you can't walk in assuming that you know what the story is before you're there. And I thought that was incredibly helpful advice, because it makes you take a step back and try to realize exactly where your limitations are. I still think that is advice I think about all the time. Like, I think you have the obligation to publish and write about recent trends and write about people you meet, and people who are attempting to prevent immigration, people who are migrating, the sort of conflicts that are arising, and that you still have to try to be figuring out all the time what the story is by listening better. And the other person who I really appreciate is this reporter at the New York Times named Patricia Cohen, who said to me at one point when I was trying to write a 5,000-word piece, you're making a mistake. You're trying to play a Bach sonata, and you should be trying to play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. And I did publish the piece, and it got better with the help of a lot of people. But I also think that that was useful advice, which is to say, like, you can dream big and you can try to take on big projects, but again, realize where you are and what your limitations are, and try to work with that. That's not a disadvantage. It's just a question of working up to it in your own practice.
Great. Here's a question for you, Allie. What steps did you take to build your startup and get a customer base initially? That's a big question, but
Okay, I like that
try to
question.
sum up.
So I think this kind of goes with the last question. I was thinking of advice I've been given, and one of the pieces was growing up, don't make someone do something that you wouldn't be willing to do yourself. And so with that, one thing that I learned in grad school was effectual entrepreneurship. And so it's kind of low risk entrepreneurship, focusing on the people that you know and the resources that you have, and it doesn't have to be a ton of money or anything like that. Instead, it could be, oh, I know that my friend is a graphic designer. What can I do with graphic design, and what can we build from there? And so it's really just getting out there and testing, and then making adjustments based on that testing. And so for me, I knew I had this product, but I didn't know if I had a lot of people that would be interested in potentially buying it, since people don't talk about UTIs all that much. And so my idea was to put together these flyers and then hang them in bathroom stalls. And so my mom and I printed these out. I'm not a graphic designer, especially if you all saw these ones. But it was just, do you get a UTI, or do you get UTIs? Would you like a natural solution? I was making some drug claims in there, but we'll just scratch that. And I said, if so, take this survey and get a free sample. And so we went to a bunch of the bathroom stalls in the University of Virginia Hospital and put these flyers up on all the bathroom stalls. I went everywhere in Charlottesville, and then whoever else I could convince to hang these posters and flyers, I did. And I got over 200 responses, and I learned things like, what do people take preventatively? What do they take for onset? How happy are they with those products? And then random comments. And so from there, I said, how can I build this as cheaply as possible, and have people try it and see if it works? And so the woman who developed it, she had data from the patients that have used it for the past 10 years. And so I had that, but I always kind of want to trust but verify. And so I wanted my own data too. And so after building that, a lot of it has tested me in various ways, whether it was making sure that I'm compliant with the FDA's current rules and regulations, getting that trademark filed, trying to find different GMP, good manufacturing practice spaces, getting a bunch of co-packers, firing some co-packers when they didn't have the same values that I had. And then just a lot of it was talking to people in person. And some of it has been going, okay, I don't have a lot of financial resources. How do I figure this out? And so the amazing woman who has helped me with the supplement label claims, like I found her by digging through past Natural Product Association meetings and trying to see the attorneys that they referenced, and going, how do I get a hold of one of these? I need to find someone who's hopefully retired and takes pity on a little startup. And so I just started calling people and going, I hope this person answers. And eventually I got her. I think she was taken aback a little bit. But that's honestly how it's been building it, is doing that, trying to get the product in as many people's hands as possible, which, by the way, I do have samples if any of you want a free sample after this. And then going from there and trying to get testimonials and feedback as I go.
Great. Excellent. This is a great question. A common theme between the three of you is public service and helping others. How do you maintain optimism when there are so many barriers to success?
I think there's a lot to be still optimistic. I think there's a lot of problems, don't get me wrong. But I look at sort of the communities and sort of leaders who came before all of us and the resiliency that they have always had, that communities of color in this country, LGBTQ communities, women's-led initiatives, there's just resiliency up the wazoo. They are sort of willing to sort of go to the mat for things. And if they are, then why shouldn't anyone else be able to? So I think there are things to be optimistic about. I think there are things to be worried about. and to be able to balance those things appropriately and to find outlets. Netflix is a great outlet for me to sort of just kind of take a breather here and there. But I think there's a lot to be optimistic about still.
Great. Anybody else want to weigh in on that one? Good. This is another good one. If you had a chance for a do-over in life, what would you do differently? Does anybody have a do-over story?
I would have liked to avoid getting on that lift, I think, in hindsight, but yeah.
That's probably the best answer.
Pretty obvious one, yes.
I think that's
Stay
best
off
answer
the
we got,
lifts,
right?
everyone.
Yeah. Public safety announcement.
Maya, this is one for you. Have you made good friends in Mexico?
Aw.
I have great friends. I also had a lot of time in the first few months to make a lot of friends, and I became really unashamed about walking up to people and be like, "Hi, we met at this event 5 seconds ago. Do you want to get coffee this week? I'm not hitting on you. I really am making new friends, and I just got here." I think that part of the joy of moving to a new place is getting to make friends who, some of my friends are freelance journalists who sort of took the same path as me, and there's an incredible camaraderie around it, and it's also cheaper to share hotels with rooms with them. And so we've spent a lot of time together, for better or for worse, as they'll tell you. And others are people who, the first time that I went and traveled with some of the collectives that I was talking about and tried to report on migrant disappearances, a lot of the reporters there became my network, and introduced me to new people who were either working on documentaries or who were creating new workshops in Mexico City, or who were working on journalist protection initiatives. And other people I were introduced to who just do interesting work. I'm great friends with someone who does forensics works in Mexico City, and and I live with, you have to find an apartment. I live with two very sweet people who work in insurance and cars, and it's not at all related to what I do, but I think that part of choosing to be uprooted and moving somewhere else again is trying to then reconstruct your networks and really depend on people in ways you wouldn't. And family took me in the first year that I was there, and I'm incredibly indebted to them, because they gave me a place to stay for many months, so I was moving between apartments, and we're a family of journalists who had 40 years more experience than I did, who I just met and said, "Well, you seem like you need some help." And taught me a ton about Mexican history and Mexican politics, and as opposed to saying, "Why are you here?" said, come to dinner with us, with our family. And I think that part of that is probably cultural. People in Mexico are very warm. But that has also meant that I've made some great friends. I would recommend doing it, and just moving is hard, but if you're not very ashamed about saying, like, let's go to a movie, let's go get some coffee, let's go to this event, let's do something, people are usually quite open to it. Most people want new friends, I think.
Perfect. What has your experience been like as a woman in your field? Anybody want to take that one on? Difficulties, barriers, surprises?
It's been a lot of camaraderie, which I think is really important. I find that my colleagues who are women have been far more open about sort of sharing some of their own struggles, and that makes it easier for me to do so, and I think that's really valuable. One thing that I do that I was telling Trish about earlier is when I know someone who may be applying for a position, one of the first things that I do is I tell them what I earn, to make sure that they are able to ask for the equivalent or more, and to just always kind of share that kind of information, and to make sure that there is at least some sort of parity in the way in which men and women are at least being paid. There have certainly been difficulties. I think I've been asked questions and been asked of things that my male counterparts would not necessarily be asked. And it's hard to know when you've been sort of reared to maybe take a back seat a little bit, or told to sort of take a front seat where the boundaries are in some of those things. But I would also ask my sort of co-panelists to maybe talk more about that.
I would say for me, I've always looked at it, well, think of me as a person, don't think of me as a woman or a man or whatever you wish. But there was an interesting study that one of my fellow female entrepreneur friends shared with me, and it's a Harvard study, and it was about raising money through venture capital and how the questions were different for women founders versus men. And it was fascinating because I haven't gone the VC route, but the questions that were geared towards women were negative. And so it was like, well, aren't you concerned about XYZ? Whereas for men, they were, wow, that seems like a great opportunity. Have you thought about A and B and how much that could grow your business? And so it's something that really opened my eyes too, in terms of, I think, whether it's people that are young or old or male or female or whomever, we need to take the positive spin a lot of times. I'm not saying it should all be positive. We need to find the holes to make things better, but at the same time, trying to level the playing field in terms of questions. It's a very basic way to do it, but it can help out.
Great. We have 5 more minutes, and I have 2 questions I hope to get in, so let's rapid fire. This one's been asked by several audience members and was on my list as well. But is there a key mentor or influencer that had a huge impact on the trajectory of your life?
I think that I have a lot of teachers who have been a huge help to me. I think one in particular who was incredibly supportive of me, who emailed me this morning, is this professor named Fred Strebe, who's in the Yale journalism department and is a magazine journalist himself, and who's one of the most enthusiastic people I've ever met. You can tell him a bunch of ideas, and he'll say, "Oh, wow," at many things. I think that the sort of unconditional support from a mentor who you can turn to over the course of several years, and who you can turn to even after you've graduated and say, things are going okay. Do you have any suggestions? Is really fantastic. Whether that person can then, connect you to other people in that field, or whether they can just say, keep going. Here's something to read that you might want to think about, is hugely invaluable.
Great. Nadia and Ali, anybody you want to?
Do you want to ask the second question, just so maybe we
Sure.
have it? Or,
Absolutely.
Try to
Question
answer
I wanted to close with was just, what is the legacy or the mark that each of you wants to leave on the world?
That's a
boy.
lot. Well, my favorite quote has always been, give the historian something to write about. So I don't know what that story's going to be quite yet, but I hope it's a darn good one, so stay tuned.
Just to go to the first question also, I sort of jokingly said, but every woman who has ever come before me in terms of mentors, but in particular, a couple of colleagues, Heather Hurlburt, who's actually a speaker here, is remarkable and is a friend of mine, and is someone whom I can sort of turn to for advice, and who recommended that I come here because she's crazy. But she's not that crazy. You should all listen to her. She's crazy smart. It's an opportunity to express gratitude to my parents, especially, who were sort of strong workers and strong parents who dedicated a life to their kids, and I'm really grateful for that. A legacy to leave behind is that I hope I have some good pals who remember me. Honestly, I think that's as good as it gets, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes we're really concerned about what's going to happen to us when we're really young in the sort of fatalistic way that I would discourage, because there's so many years to figure it out. I would love to write a novel, but it's never going to happen because I'm so bad at writing fiction, and I used to think of that as like the legacy that one should leave, because journalism is fleeting, and I think that's also part of the fun of it, though, is that you will write an article that maybe some graduate student in the future will seek out in the archives for their history project, but in all likelihood, it will disappear into the internet and will be replaced by something else later. And so you can talk about a body of work that you would like to create, or the way that the field has influenced public opinion, and I think most of the time we don't really have the perspective to try to understand even what's happening in this present moment. You know, you can take hopefully some ideas from what people have written before, and yet we're all trying to figure it out as we go along. And so I don't know, like, I think that you can try to talk about contributing to your present moment, and then maybe some years from now we'll have more perspective to say what actually happened as a result. But we have time to do that, I think.
Absolutely, plenty of time. Well, thank you all for attending the session and spending part of your day with us. Thank you.
Thanks for hanging out with us, y'all.
Yeah.